Today, I speak with Michael Robbins, who is director of the Arab Barometer. Arab Barometer is a central resource for quantitative research on the Middle East and North Africa, and I have conducted essential surveys right before the October 7th attacks in Israel, focused on Gaza and the West Bank. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Marissa. It's great to be here.
Much has been said and reported by different political leaders here in the United States and elsewhere across the world about what the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank actually think of Hamas prior to October 7th. And the Arab Barometer conducted surveys just before the attacks. What did you learn about Hamas's popularity or lack thereof in the Palestinian territories?
So we were able to conduct a survey that finished right before the attacks took place. So we finished in Gaza on October 6th, and we finished in the West Bank with a few interviews on October 8th. So it is right before the attacks. We have a representative survey that can give us insight into these questions. We find, focusing on Gaza first, what we find is that there's very low support for Hamas. We find that the trust in the Hamas government is only about 29%. The same percent have trust in Hamas. Overall, the level of the percentage of people who say that they feel closest to Hamas of all the political factions is only about 23%. So what we see is that there's not really high level of support in Gaza. In the West Bank, it's actually even lower. What we see there is somewhat lower support, but again, what we see broadly is that there's very low levels of support for Hamas in either the West Bank or in Gaza.
And why were there low levels of support? I mean, of course, Gaza in particular has been under a blockade for more than 16 years, and Hamas has been governing. So what were the main reasons cited?
So this is certainly the challenges in Gaza were extreme. What we saw in the survey, we asked people, have you gone hungry in the past month? And 3/4 of Gazans had gone hungry. And this was again before the recent bombardment, the cutoff of electricity, fuel, and any essential basic necessities coming into Gaza. So this was already very extreme. And just 2 years ago, only about half said the same. So again, there was a significant challenges facing Gaza economically. One of the things that we found very surprising was that when we asked people, what is the cause of the shortage of food, the most common response was actually government mismanagement. It was not the blockade. Other factors were inflation, which was again above the blockade. So it does seem that many Palestinians in Gaza thought that essentially Hamas's mismanagement, the fact that Hamas was in a way perhaps continuing the blockade given the challenges it faces with the Israeli authorities. And so out of that, what we find is that people were essentially turning to the government saying that you've mismanaged this economy, you've mismanaged rule. And the second factor really was corruption. We find is that the majority of Gazans said there is significant corruption in the government. And one of the findings that we looked at was that who is it that's not trusting Hamas? It is those who are poor, perhaps those who don't have access to the networks of corruption that exist within Gaza. And so those that were potentially outside of the government networks, those who could potentially get cash, and those who are particularly hungry, who were really struggling economically, were those who were likely blaming Hamas for their predicament.
And I think it's a reminder to all our viewers as well that Gaza has a population of 2.3 million people. The majority are children. And so when you're zooming into the adult population, then these percentages are even more significant when you look at the whole population. So you also asked questions about where people stand with regards to relations with Israel, the two-state solution. I mean, we're of course talking here about a 56-year-old occupation of Palestinian territories, and no end in sight, even before October 7th, or a political resolution to the conflict. So how did people feel about the two-state solution in particular, but any sort of path towards resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
So we did ask a question about what is what is your preferred path to settling this conflict? And in Gaza and in the West Bank, we found that about half, or in fact, in Gaza, 54% said that they favored the two-state solution. Two of the other options we offered was a one-state solution, basically Israelis and Palestinians living side by side, or a confederation, which would be a looser political arrangement where essentially there is a one state, but there is a lot of autonomy for each of the two groups. And so what we found is that about 1 in 10 supported each of these two options in Gaza. What that totals to is about 73% of Gazans said that they favored one of the peaceful solutions, with the predominant one being the two-state solution, basically the implementation of the Oslo Accords living within the 1967 borders. So overall, we find very low levels of support for Hamas's broader ideology. That said, we did offer another option, which was other, to gauge what people thought. And what the 20% of people did choose this option in Gaza, what they all chose was some type of military resistance, which is consistent with Hamas's ideology of the destruction of the state of Israel. Amongst that group, 77% supported Hamas, others supported Islamic Jihad. So this really is zooming out kind of on this. It is consistent that those who are engaged in supporting this Hamas ideology are also those who are supporters of Hamas generally. So we can see is that really 75% of those who do not support Hamas really don't seem to be the basically in favor of the destruction of Israel. They do want a peaceful solution. So I think that that's a very high number, something that I think has often been missed, particularly in the discussions that have been happening with Israeli leadership, blaming the citizens or the Palestinians living in Gaza for the attacks and for supporting Hamas and bringing them to power. But we do see that most of them were in favor of a peaceful solution.
And what about Palestinians that you also interviewed in the West Bank? I think what I'm also curious to know is how is the Palestinian Authority viewed in the West Bank and in Gaza? And I think, one of the issues that is discussed now about the day after is how challenging it's going to be for the Palestinian Authority to take over, given that it has been enfeebled over the years, partially by Israel, but also it's lost its credibility due to, other reasons, corruption, mismanagement, etc. So what did you find with regards to the Palestinian Authority?
So essentially what you said is correct. It would be very challenging. The Palestinian Authority has lost a lot of credibility. It has not held elections for years. I think Mahmoud Abbas at this point is in the 18th or 19th year before your term. It has not been held accountable. And so what we find is very low levels of support. In fact, the levels of support for the Palestinian Authority are actually lower in the West Bank than they are in Gaza. But overall, it is very, very low levels of support. And really that comes back to the issues that you're listing. Certainly the Palestinian Authority has not been successful in negotiating and the Oslo Accords. It's not been successful in finding a way to move forward with the peace process. But I think more broadly, we see the levels of corruption are seen as even higher in the West Bank than they were in Gaza. Certainly people are very frustrated. People want Mahmoud Abbas to resign. He has the lowest level of support of any political actor that we ask about. So the thought of having the Palestinian Authority come in and assume power in Gaza, I mean, it's very difficult to imagine it having legitimacy. Beyond that, if it does essentially ride in the back of Israeli tanks to take power, it would also lose more credibility, I think. And so it doesn't really seem like a viable solution. It really, really is a major challenge to think about what could possibly fill the void, the vacuum. And in part, that's the broader problem that we're seeing, is that when we ask people in the West Bank, who would you vote for if there were elections held for president? The most common response is we would simply not participate. There is simply no one who is really trusted in a position that could fill that role. And so rebuilding that credibility, building institutions, building a movement that could actually fulfill the wishes of the Palestinian people is really a challenge we see from the survey that doesn't seem to be either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority having much credibility at this point.
And this leadership vacuum, of course, adds to all of this, the absence, as you said, of just leaders who could be pointed to as individuals who can actually move in and take charge. One last question to you, Michael, about how Israel, the United States, and maybe others are viewed, other key Arab countries in the region are viewed by Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And I really mean to ask this because, you know, there have been lots of concerns and questions in Washington about the Abraham Accords and how people also view the Abraham Accords and how basically the Abraham Accords have basically been at a pause right now due to the current war. So what did you find about perceptions of these countries?
So we find that support for the United States is very low, and you can think about certainly the perception that it has been declining even in the past decade across both the West Bank and Gaza. In the sense that I think comes out of this, that certainly as the settlements have expanded, as again, the Palestinians in the issues that they care about don't appear to have been taken into consideration as the Abraham Accords are signed. We do see a decline there. One of the interesting things we find is that there is an increase in support for Saudi Arabia. This has been in decline for many, many years. The past decade, we've seen it sliding down. There was a bit of an increase, and it is notable that certainly the Palestinian Authority went and essentially, as there was discussion of the normalization between Saudi and Israel, that there were demands placed fairly publicly from the Palestinian side. So it may be that Saudi Arabia was seen as perhaps standing up a bit more. Again, it's still viewed very relatively poorly, with a clear minority saying that they are favorable towards Saudi. The two countries we really see standing out are Turkey and Qatar. And so Turkey certainly is viewed positively across both. You can think both the West Bank and in Gaza. You can think about what Erdogan has done very symbolically at times, sending an aid ship to break the blockade in Gaza. It wasn't successful, but certainly forwarding the Palestinian cause. There's been a bit of a decline in support for Erdogan in the last couple of years, but overall, Turkey still, the majority do view Turkey positively in Palestine, both in the West Bank and Gaza. Qatar is a bit more divisive. It is viewed positively in both the West Bank and Gaza, but it tends to be more supported in Gaza. And I think you can attribute that to the fact that Qatar has been supplying a lot of the money that is flowing into Gaza over the past few years. But again, it is something that both of these countries, I think, are those who would have a greater support, greater legitimacy in the minds of Palestinians. We think about ending this conflict, and obviously Qatar is playing a key role right now. Turkey, I think, to a lesser role, but certainly both of those, I think, would need to be at the table to really represent the Palestinian interests, at least in the public opinion, to give the settlement to this a bit more credibility, because I do think those are who Palestinians view as their main countries that are supporting their cause.
And I know that from previous iterations of the Arab Barometer, there were also questions about the Abraham Accords. So what have you seen in the West Bank and Gaza, also in comparison to other Arab countries, keeping in mind, of course, that the Abraham Accords just commemorated 3 years in September?
So we see very low levels of support for the Abraham Accords across the region. Unfortunately, we haven't finished surveys in other countries this way. We don't have an updated percentage. But what I think we will see is a lower level of support. Typically, in most countries, we see about 10% in favor. That's really true the same in Palestine. We see a small percentage in favor of the accords. But again, the vast majority, essentially 9 and 10 in most countries. There are a few places this is an exception. We see differences in the last wave in Morocco and Sudan, two countries that did normalize. Essentially, the groups there that are more in favor of those are those who are more educated, who may see the trade-off, the Western Sahara, for recognition of Israel and Sudan being taken off the state sponsors of terrorism. So there is some movement there. I think it does suggest that if there is a real deal that could really move Oslo forward or move some of the ideas behind that forward, that it's not something that the Palestinians would necessarily have the same opinion of. But I do think insofar as these have been made with the UAE, with Bahrain, and with the other countries, without really advancing Palestinian rights, without advancing any of their interests to move towards a independent Palestine, certainly I don't think that you're going to see support there. But I think looking at the other countries, we do see that when there is some type of benefit, particularly those who are more educated, who may understand that trade-off, do change. But I don't expect any change in Palestine unless there is a significant shift in how these accords are being negotiated to really center the Palestinian issue and find a settlement to the conflict.
Michael Robbins, thank you so much for your time today and for shedding light on the important work that you do to help all of us in the policymaking community better understand perceptions and public opinion in the Arab world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marissa. It was great talking with you.